The rifle shot hit before anyone saw her pull the trigger. 1 second. Sergeant Major Roland Voss was laughing so hard his face had gone red. The next second, a steel target 700 meters downrange swung back on its chain with a sound like a hammer striking a church bell, and every soldier standing on the line at Harrow Peak Military Medical Center's training range went completely silent. The woman who had fired the shot lowered the weapon carefully, checked the safety, and handed it back to the range officer without a word. She was wearing scrubs, not fatigues, not a range jacket. Pale blue medical scrubs with a small laminated badge clipped to her collar that read Nursing Staff Ward C, and Roland Voss stared at that badge like it had personally insulted him, because it meant the most precise shot anyone on that range had witnessed in 3 years had just been fired by a woman who was supposed to be administering IV drips 2 buildings away. Her name was Nora Calloway. And what happened at Harrow Peak over the following 72 hours would destroy one man's career, end another man's freedom, and force an entire military installation to reckon with exactly how much damage quiet people can do when you spend long enough pretending they aren't in the room. If this story keeps you watching until the end, hit that subscribe button right now and drop a like, and tell me in the comments what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story has traveled. Let's go. The morning it started, Nora Calloway arrived at Harrow Peak's East Wing at 6:47, which was 11 minutes earlier than her scheduled shift. She did this not because she was trying to impress anyone, but because Ward C's supply closet had been mislabeled 3 weeks running, and if she didn't personally recount the IV bags before rounds started, one of the overnight nurses would inevitably prepare a cart with the wrong saline concentration. It had happened twice in the last month. Once had sent a patient into mild distress. Nora had been the one who caught it both times, and she had filed incident reports both times. And both times the reports had been reviewed and filed, and absolutely nothing had changed. So she counted the bags herself. That was who she was. She was 34 years old and had been at Harrow Peak for 6 weeks. She was quiet in the way that reads as timid to people who don't pay attention, which was most people. She wore her brown hair pulled back and had a habit of tilting her head slightly to one side when she was listening to something, which some of the other nurses had interpreted as uncertainty, and some of the doctors had interpreted as deference, and both groups had adjusted their behavior toward her, accordingly explaining things slowly, choosing her for the administrative tasks, leaving her out of the conversations that happened around the coffee machine after senior staff left the room. None of this bothered Nora particularly. She had worked in environments where being underestimated was the most dangerous liability a person could carry. Here, it was just noise. She was reviewing intake charts at the nurse's station when the first call came down from Range Command. It was a routine notice not unusual at Harrow Peak, which was a combined military medical facility and training installation. The medical and combat training wings operated on the same campus, which meant nursing staff occasionally got swept into administrative range activities. Every so often, the range needed a medical presence on standby during live fire evaluations, and today's memo was requesting one certified staffer from Ward C to be present at Range Delta by 0900 for the quarterly marksmanship evaluations. The head nurse on the morning rotation, a compact woman named Greta Souza, read the memo aloud and looked around the station with the expression of someone trying to figure out who she could send without losing her most useful person for the morning. Her eyes landed on Nora. "Calloway," Greta said. "You don't have any procedures until 11. Take the range assignment." Nora looked up from the chart. "Medical standby?" "Just presence. Take a first aid bag, stand near the wall, and don't touch anything." Greta was already moving on. "It's 3 hours tops." Nora took the first aid bag. She arrived at Range Delta at 8:52. Range Delta was the installation's long-distance precision range, a flat, wide corridor of packed earth stretching out beneath a gray morning sky, with concrete firing positions along the near edge and steel silhouettes at distances marked from 300 to 1,200 meters. The morning light was low, and the wind was already moving across the range in the uneven gust and drop pattern that the terrain around Harrow Peak always produced. Nora positioned herself at the back of the covered observation deck, the way she'd been told near the wall, out of the way, and set her first aid bag down beside her feet, and watched the unit assemble. There were around 40 soldiers in the rotation for the day, running through the quarterly qualification evaluation supervised by Range Officer Dwight Prawl and overseen by Sergeant Major Roland Voss. The evaluation was a formal affair. Scores were recorded, qualification tiers were assigned, and those tiers determined combat assignment eligibility for the next quarter. It mattered. Everyone on that range knew it mattered. Roland Voss walked the line like he owned it. He was broad through the chest, with the kind of physical confidence that comes from years of being the largest person in every room he entered. He had 22 years of service behind him, a shelf of commendations in his office, and a way of speaking to subordinates that made it sound like he was doing them a favor by addressing them at all. He spotted Nora within 30 seconds of arriving on the deck. "What's the medic situation?" he said to Prahl, loud enough that it carried. "Ward C sent someone for standby." Voss looked at Nora. She looked back at him, the nurse. He said it the way some people say background noise, as a descriptor of something irrelevant. He turned back to the range. "Fine, she can stay over there. Keep her away from the equipment." Nora stayed where she was and didn't respond. The evaluation started at 9:15. The first group of soldiers took their positions, and Prahl began calling distances. The rifle fire was steady and professional. These were trained soldiers running a familiar protocol, and most of them were competent. Not exceptional. Competent. Several in the middle group shot scores that looked adequate on paper but showed, to anyone watching the pattern of hits, that they were grouping right under pressure a common mechanical error, right-handed shooters, torquing slightly on the trigger pull when the sequence sped up. Nora noticed. She said nothing. The problem started around the 40-minute mark when a young soldier in the third group, a corporal named Adkins, maybe 22 years old, with the particular kind of focused tension in his jaw that indicated he'd been preparing for this evaluation all week, had a malfunction on his first shot. The bolt failed to cycle correctly. It wasn't catastrophic, but the sequence was paused while Prahl came to assess. And the delay put Adkins off his rhythm enough that when he finally took his shots, his score came in borderline. Prahl marked it. Voss watched. And then Prahl moved to the next column, without flagging the malfunction in the score notation. Nora noticed that too. She wasn't supposed to. She was a nurse standing at the back of an observation deck holding a first aid bag. But she had noticed, and the number that Prahl entered was not annotated with the equipment malfunction that had interrupted the corporal's sequence, which meant Adkins' borderline score would be evaluated clean. No equipment exception noted, no review flag, and if that score put him below qualification, he would carry it forward without recourse. She considered the incident report she would file when she got back to Ward C. She considered how it would be received. She thought about the 2 saline reports, still sitting in a filing system somewhere collecting digital dust, and decided she already knew the answer. The evaluation moved through its rotations. Nora watched and stayed quiet. It was just past 10:30 when Voss walked to the back of the deck. He did it casually, crossing to get water from a cooler near the wall, but he slowed as he passed her, and his eyes traveled to the medical tablet she was holding. She'd been using it to take notes. She'd kept the screen angled out of easy line of sight, but Voss had the acquisitive gaze of a man who monitored his environment as a matter of habit. "What are you writing?" Nora looked up. Observation notes. Standard standby documentation for a range evaluation. Medical standby protocol includes documenting anything that could have health implications, she said. It's procedural. Voss studied her for a moment. "You've been watching the shooting. It's hard not to." He almost smiled. It wasn't warm. "Tell you what, nurse, you have an opinion about marksmanship. You're welcome to demonstrate one." He said it to the nearby soldiers. The way people say things they know will get a laugh. And he got one. "Step up. Show us something." She looked at him for a long moment. "All right," she said. The laughter settled into something more uncertain when she set the tablet down, walked to the firing line, and picked up the evaluation rifle properly, safely, with the practiced ease of someone who had done it 10,000 times before. Voss crossed his arms, 700 meters, fixed target. "Let's see the nurse shoot." Nora settled into position. She checked the wind. It was moving in cross gusts, 7 to 12 miles per hour, left to right, with an inconsistency in the lower register that indicated the terrain was funneling it. She adjusted. She breathed out slowly, the way you breathe out when you have done this long enough that the stillness is not something you manufacture, but something you return to. She fired. The steel target 700 meters out swung back on its chain. The range went quiet. Voss stared at the target for a moment. Then he looked at Nora. Then he said, "Luck. The way people say things they know aren't true, but say anyway, because the alternative is harder." What happened in the next hour was the kind of thing that people who were there would describe differently depending on who they were. The soldiers who had been shooting all morning would say. Voss pushed the evaluation further to make a point. Voss himself would later claim it was a legitimate field assessment, that offering a medical civilian the chance to run a precision evaluation was not unusual. Range Officer Prawl would say nothing useful to anyone. What actually happened was this. Voss pushed the distance to 800 meters, moving target. Nora hit it. He moved it to 900, reduced exposure window, added wind compensation at the scope. She hit that too, reading the gust pattern, the same way she'd read the first one by watching the way the air moved the target's chain before it reached the firing position. Several of the soldiers who'd been scoring adequately all morning started watching her the way you watch something that reclassifies itself in real time. Voss moved the distance to 1,000 meters and brought in a crosswind simulation fans positioned at intervals, variable speed, the kind of condition that legitimate advanced evaluations used as a capstone challenge. This was not a standard qualification exercise. This was something that exceeded the quarterly evaluation protocol, and Prawl was writing it down in the log without flagging that it was non-standard, which was a problem Nora cataloged for later. She stepped up to the line. She looked downrange for a moment longer than the previous shots. The wind simulation was uneven intentionally so, and the target was partially obscured at the 800-meter interval marker by a lateral beam, which meant the actual engagement window was approximately 40% smaller than a standard 1,000-meter shot. She adjusted for it. She fired. Center mass, the sound the target made when it hit was the same as all the others. That flat, clear, metallic ring. But something in the atmosphere on the range changed when it happened at 1,000 meters. Because that was the number that meant something different. The soldiers were no longer watching Voss for cues about how to react. They were watching Nora. "That's a hell of a shot," one of them said quietly. Not to Voss, and the soldier next to him nodded without looking away from the range. Voss said nothing for a moment. His jaw was working slightly, the way jaws work when people are deciding things. Then he said, "You had 3 warm-up shots. Adjust it." "I didn't have warm-up shots," Nora said. "That was the first time I fired today." He looked at her. "Don't correct me in front of my unit." "I'm not correcting you. I'm clarifying a factual inaccuracy before it becomes part of the record." Something shifted in Voss's expression. Not toward anger, exactly. Toward recalculation. He walked back toward Prawl and said something low enough that Nora couldn't hear it. She watched Prawl nod and make a notation in the evaluation log. She couldn't read what it said from where she was standing, but the body language was specific enough to tell her what had happened. Voss had just decided to formalize what he was doing. Whatever came next wasn't a casual challenge anymore. It was at 11:20 that the accident happened. One of the mid-range positions, a standard setup. Nothing unusual developed an equipment fault during a routine reset cycle. The mechanism that controlled the target movement arm had been used heavily all morning, and something in the drive gear had worn enough to cause a lateral misfire. Instead of cycling the target back to neutral, the arm swung at 40 degrees toward the forward observation position, which placed the steel face of the target directly on a trajectory that would have intersected with 2 soldiers who were walking forward to check their scoring sheet. It happened in about 3 seconds. Prawl saw it happen and froze. Voss was turned away. Nora was already moving. She crossed the concrete in 4 steps, caught both soldiers by the back of their jackets, and pulled them backward with the full weight of her body before either of them had processed what was happening. The arm swung through the space they had occupied a half-second earlier and came to a grinding stop against the safety rail, which absorbed the impact with a sound like a struck anvil. The range went from evaluation noise to complete silence. One of the soldiers she'd pulled, the corporal named Adkins, the same one whose malfunction had been inadequately recorded, looked at the trajectory the arm had tracked, and then looked at the space where he'd been standing, and then looked at Nora. "What just he started?" "The drive gear failed," she said. She was already scanning the other positions, checking for secondary hazards. "Don't move forward until someone cuts the power to that mechanism." She turned to Prawl. "You need to shut it down." Prawl moved. He was shaken enough that he was moving faster than he probably normally did. Voss turned around. He took in the scene 2 soldiers, standing where they hadn't been a moment ago, Nora between them and the malfunctioning arm, Prawl at the power cutoff, and his expression went through a rapid sequence of things that didn't completely settle. "What happened?" he said. "Target arm malfunction," Norris said. "Corporal Adkins and Specialist Yoon were in the trajectory path. The arm has been cycled enough this morning that the gear mechanism shows wear stress on the lateral housing." She said it like she was reading from an incident report she was already composing in her head. Voss looked at her for a moment. "How did you see that before the range officer did?" "I was watching it." "You were watching a mechanical housing on a target arm." "I was watching everything," she said. "That's my job." It wasn't her job. Her job was to stand at the back of the observation deck with a first aid bag. But nobody said that, because both of the soldiers she'd just pulled out of a machine's path were standing there, and it was not the moment for that argument. Senior Command arrived at 11:43. Nora hadn't called them. She hadn't called anyone. She'd been sitting on the edge of the concrete platform writing in her medical tablet now, in addition to observation notes, documenting the mechanical failure, the response timeline, the inadequate flagging of the target arm's condition in the pre-range safety checklist when a black vehicle pulled through the range gate and parked. The officer who stepped out wore the insignia of a full colonel. She was followed by two personnel that Nora recognized by their uniform classifications as belonging to the Inspector General's division. Their names were Colonel Miriam Taft, and behind her, a taller man with a IG insignia and a data tablet, Major Del Krause. Voss straightened immediately. Prahl, who had been speaking with the range maintenance team about the equipment failure, stopped mid-sentence. Colonel Taft surveyed the range with the particular quality of attention that senior command uses when they are not surveying casually. She walked to the safety rail, looked at the arc the damaged target arm had swung, looked at the scoring position that had been in the path, and then turned and looked directly at Nora. "You're Calloway?" she said. "Yes, ma'am." Ward seat. "Yes, ma'am." Taft looked at her for a long moment. Something in that look was not the look of a colonel examining a ward nurse. It was something else, a quality of recognition, or something adjacent to recognition, carefully contained. "Sergeant Major Voss," Taft said, "I'll need your evaluation logs. Today's full session." Voss hesitated for a fraction of a second before recovering. "Of course, ma'am, Prahl, all logs," Taft said, "including the non-standard evaluation extensions from this morning's session." She said it without looking at him. She was still looking at the scoring position, including the recorded and unrecorded ones. The range went quiet again. This time it was a different kind of quiet. Prahl's face had gone the specific color of someone who has understood, only now, that the thing they thought was invisible was not. Voss had gone still in the way that physically large people go still when they realize the situation has changed from one in which their size is the most relevant variable to one in which it is not. "Ma'am," he said carefully. "Is there a specific concern that—" "I have several specific concerns," Taft said, and now she did turn to look at him. "We can discuss them at the command building. Major Krause will stay here to complete an evidence collection." She paused. "I would recommend you contact your legal counsel representative before that meeting." The words hung in the air. A few of the soldiers standing near the firing line exchanged glances. Corporal Adkins was watching Nora. She wasn't watching him. She was watching the vehicle that had arrived behind Taft's, which had just pulled through the range gate. The second vehicle was unmarked. The two people who stepped out of it were in civilian clothing, but moved the way people move when they have extensive experience with military installations and are trying not to look like it. Nora had the tablet in her hands. She was still taking notes. By noon, the range at Harrow Peak had been suspended, the remaining quarterly evaluations postponed, and Sergeant Major Roland Voss had been escorted, not quite under guard but not quite independently, toward the command building at the far edge of the installation. Range Officer Dwight Prahl had been asked to remain on site pending a records review. Nora was sitting on a folding chair at the edge of the range deck, still in her scrubs, the first aid bag between her feet, when Major Krause came over and crouched down to her level so that the conversation didn't require her to stand. He was a careful man. She appreciated that. "We're going to need the notes from your tablet," he said. "From this morning." "I know," she said. "I'll provide them." He was looking at her in the same way Taft had looked at her, that quality of something restrained. "How long were you planning to be here?" "My shift ends at 4. "Right," he said. "Your shift." He said it without inflection, but with a very specific kind of flatness that told her he knew the word was not entirely accurate. She looked at him. He looked at her. "She's going to want to talk to you," he said. "I know that too." He nodded and stood. He walked back toward the second vehicle, and the two civilians from that vehicle were now talking to the range maintenance team, and one of them had a camera that was documenting the mechanical arms gear housing the exact point of failure, the wear patterns, the indicators that someone with a maintenance checklist responsibility had either missed or, possibly, chosen not to document. Nora watched them work. She was thinking about Corporal Adkins' score, the borderline result that had been recorded without the equipment exception notation, which meant it was sitting in a system right now as a clean fail. She was thinking about the 4 other scores she'd observed during the morning that had seemed similarly incomplete in their documentation. She was thinking about the pattern that those scores formed. which was not a pattern of coincidence, but of selection. She was thinking about what that selection meant, and who it had benefited, and what someone had received in exchange for systematically misrecording military qualification scores. She had been thinking about this since approximately 10:20 that morning, which was not coincidentally about the time she'd first seen Prahl's notation method up close. She hadn't come to Harrow Peak to count IV bags. She had come for this. The wind was still moving across the range in the same uneven pattern it had moved all morning, gust and drop, and somewhere downrange. The steel targets hung still on their chains in the midday gray, and nobody was shooting, and the range was quiet for the first time since 9:15. Nora looked at the 1,000-meter mark. She looked at the target that was still angled slightly from her last shot. She looked away. She had work to do, and none of it involved a rifle. Colonel Taft was standing by the command vehicle now, phone to her ear, and she was looking in Nora's direction with the kind of focused attention that had nothing to do with the nurse the rest of the installation thought it knew. Nora met her eyes across the range. Then Taft said something into the phone, and whatever she said made the person on the other end go silent. And Taft turned away and kept talking in the careful, measured voice of someone arranging things that cannot be unarranged. Adkins was the one who walked over. He came quietly, stopping about 2 feet away, still processing the morning the way young soldiers process things when the context has shifted faster than explanation has followed. "The arm," he said. "You saw it before it moved. The housing vibration changes before the gear slips," she said. "You can hear it if the range is quiet enough." It wasn't quiet. It was quiet enough, she said. He was quiet for a moment. "Are you actually a nurse?" She looked at him. She thought about the question. She considered the several accurate answers and chose the most honest one. "Yes," she said. "I'm also other things." He nodded slowly, the way people nod when an answer makes sense even though it opens more questions than it closes. "My score this morning," he said. "The borderline one. The malfunction it wasn't noted. I know, is that?" He stopped. "Try it again. Is that part of what's happening?" She looked at him for a long moment. He was 22 years old and had prepared for a qualification evaluation and had had his equipment fail and had then nearly walked into a mechanical arm and was now standing at the edge of a range that had just been suspended by an IG officer, while a nurse in scrubs took notes on a medical tablet. He deserved a real answer. "Yes," she said, "it's part of it." He let out a breath. Not relief exactly, recognition. "Okay," he said. He didn't ask anything else. He turned and walked back to where the other soldiers were standing in the uncertain grouping of people waiting for instruction, and Nora watched him go, and then she opened her tablet and went back to her notes. There was still a great deal she hadn't written down, and the afternoon was going to be long, and there were names in her notes that would matter before. This was over names attached to scores, attached to money, attached to 4 soldiers, whose records she had seen in a file 700 miles from this range. Soldiers who had qualified on paper for combat assignments they were not prepared for, who had died in the field because the preparation their qualification was supposed to guarantee had never actually happened. She wrote carefully. She wrote everything. Outside, the wind shifted, and the 1,000-meter target swung once on its chain, a small quiet motion, in an empty range in the middle of the day, and then went still again. There was still a great deal she hadn't written down, and the afternoon was going to be long. And there were names in her notes that would matter before this was over. The meeting happened at 1:15, not in the command building, where Voss had been escorted, not in any of the formal briefing rooms that Harrow Peak maintained for operational reviews. It happened in a small windowless office 2 corridors behind the range's administrative annex, a room with a folding table, 4 chairs, a water pitcher nobody touched, and a door that Colonel Taft closed herself before sitting down. Nora sat across from her. Major Krause sat to the side, tablet open, stylus ready. "You've been here 6 weeks, Taft said. It wasn't a question. 6 weeks, 2 days. Ward C nursing staff. Yes. Taft looked at her. The quality of that look had changed from what it was. On the range, the careful containment was still there, but something underneath it had relaxed by a degree, like a door that's been held shut, finally being allowed to sit slightly ajar. "The filing came through from Central at 0600 this morning," Taft said. "The authorization for me to be here, officially with Krause." She paused. "It cleared 4 days later than it was supposed to." "I know," Nora said. "I was watching for it. You had 6 weeks of collected observations without formal authorization to act on them. I had 6 weeks of collected observations that I documented carefully and kept in a secured channel," Nora said. "I wasn't acting, I was watching." "There's a difference." "Yes," Nora said, "there is." Krause made a note. Taft leaned back slightly and studied the ceiling for a moment, which was not the posture of a senior officer losing the thread of a conversation, but of one doing the specific mental work of fitting pieces together in a way they hadn't quite fit before. "Walk me through this morning," she said. "From your perspective. All of it." Nora walked her through it. She was precise about times. She was specific about what she had observed, and careful to distinguish between what she had observed and what she had inferred. Because the difference mattered enormously when it came to what could be acted on versus what could only be considered. She told Taft about Adkins's malfunction and Prahl's notation. She told her about the pattern she'd seen across the morning's scoring, the way certain evaluations were recorded differently from others, the clustering of the irregularities around a specific subset of soldiers in specific assignment tracks. She told her about the equipment malfunction and exactly how she'd seen it coming. Taft listened without interrupting. Krause took notes. When Nora finished, the room was quiet for a moment. "The 4 soldiers," Taft said. "You identified them from Central's records before you came here. Their qualification scores were in the system," Nora said. "Harrow Peak's range certification logs. The scores looked clean, but their unit field assessors filed debrief reports that didn't match the qualification levels. Soldiers qualifying in the top 15% of precision marksmanship, who were firing in the field like they'd barely passed basic. Which means the qualification scores weren't real." "The scores existed," Nora said. "Someone just didn't earn them." Taft was quiet. "And you think Prahl was the mechanism?" "Prahl was recording the scores. Whether he decided alone or someone decided with him, that's what the financial records will answer." Krause looked up from his tablet. "We pulled Prahl's personal accounts this morning. There are transfers, 3 of them, over the past 14 months. The amounts are inconsistent with his service pay." Nora said nothing. She had suspected as much. Suspecting it and hearing it confirmed were different enough experiences that she needed a moment. "How much?" she said, Krause told her. It was enough to mean this had not been a moment of weakness or a single lapse in judgment. It was a business. Someone had set up a system and run it for over a year, and 4 soldiers had deployed with qualifications they hadn't earned and had died in situations that their actual skill level had not prepared them for. Nora looked at the table, the water pitcher, the empty chairs. "What's Voss's situation?" she said. "He's speaking with legal counsel," Taft said. "We're not certain yet how much he knew. He didn't push the evaluation this morning because he knew what I was," Nora said. "He pushed it because he was embarrassed. There's a difference. You're defending him?" "I'm distinguishing," she said. "Embarrassed is a personnel problem. Knowing and participating is a criminal one. They need different responses." Taft looked at her for a long moment. "Noted," she said. And then, with the tone of someone closing one part of a conversation and opening another, "We need to discuss your formal status for the next phase." "I thought you might," Nora said. "Your cover designation ends today. As of the authorization that came through at 0600, you are operating under your substantive title." Nora nodded. "Which means I need to introduce you to the installation command staff this afternoon as what you actually are." Taft paused. "That's going to be a conversation." "Yes," Nora said. "It probably will be." The installation command staff meeting was at 3 o'clock. Nora did not change out of her scrubs. She considered it she had a uniform, folded in a locked case, in the room she'd been assigned in the medical staff quarters, and she could have retrieved it and arrived in the command building looking like what she actually was. But she thought about the morning, and about the way things had unfolded, and decided that arriving as herself in the clothes that this installation had spent 6 weeks deciding to find her was actually more accurate than a uniform would have been. She walked into the briefing room with Taft on her left, and Krause 2 steps behind. There were 8 people around the table. Senior medical officer, installation logistics chief, 2 representatives from the operations division, the deputy commander, and 3 personnel she hadn't interacted with during her time at Harrow Peak. They all had the same expression the one people have when they know something has happened, but not yet exactly what. Voss was not in the room. Prahl was not in the room. Taft stood at the head of the table and said, "This briefing pertains to an ongoing Inspector General investigation. The information conveyed here is classified pending formal disclosure proceedings. I'll ask everyone to hold questions until I've finished." She laid it out cleanly. The investigation, the qualification records, the financial transfers, the 4 deceased soldiers, the 6-week undercover assessment that had been running inside Harrow Peak's Ward C nursing rotation. And then she said, "The officer who conducted that assessment is Captain Nora Calloway, signed to the Precision Evaluation Integrity Division of the Joint Assessment Command." Captain Calloway, you have the floor. The room was quiet. Nora looked around the table. She could see the recalibration happening in real time. On several faces, the senior medical officer, who had assigned her to supply inventory tasks 3 weeks ago, because he'd thought she was underutilizing, the operations rep, who had once spoken over her in a hallway briefing, without pausing to acknowledge her presence, the deputy commander who had signed off on Prall's quarterly performance reviews with commendations. She put her hands flat on the table. The falsification scheme at this installation has been running for approximately 14 months, she said. Range Officer Prall recorded inflated qualification scores for at least 11 soldiers across 3 qualification periods. Those soldiers were then assigned to combat roles, commensurate with their false scores roles, that required precision skills they had not actually developed. 4 of those soldiers are dead. The remaining 7 are currently deployed, and their actual skill levels relative to their assignment requirements need to be urgently assessed. The deputy commander, a man named Hargrove, late 50s, the particular stillness of someone trying to determine how much of this is going to land on him, said, "What was the mechanism? How was Prall managing the documentation?" "The scoring system at Range Delta uses dual entry logging," Nora said. "The range officer records the initial score, and a secondary system confirms it. Prall was exploiting a 30-minute window in the secondary system's auto-convergence function. He'd enter the actual score initially, then modify it before the window closed. The modified score confirmed automatically, and nobody caught it. The only way to catch it would have been to compare the initial entry timestamp against the final confirmed value, which would require someone to specifically run that comparison against a suspicion. Nobody was looking for it until you. Until me," she said. Hargrove looked at the table for a moment. "How did you know to look?" "Soldiers were dying in a pattern," she said. The pattern indicated a skill gap. The skill gap was inconsistent with their qualification records. When the qualification records don't match the outcomes, you look at who was recording the qualifications. The room was quiet again. The senior medical officer, the one who had given her inventory tasks, was looking at his hands. "Captain," he said. He stopped. Started again. "The assignment to inventory management. I gave you that assignment." "Yes, sir. I thought you were." He stopped. "It's all right," she said. She meant it. It was a reasonable assumption. It was not an absolution, but it was what she had. He nodded once and looked at the table and didn't say anything else. Prall's formal interview began at 4:30. Nora was not in the room for it. Her role in the investigation was documentation and initial assessment. The interviews, the formal interrogation, the legal procedure, those belonged to Krause and the IG team that had arrived with the second vehicle. She understood her lane. She stayed in it. She was in a small monitoring room adjacent to the interview space, watching through a feed on a laptop, when Prall first asked about his legal counsel, and then, upon being told that counsel was en route and he could wait, said instead, and this surprised even Krause, whose face showed it, "I want to tell you what happened." Krause reset his recorder. "Go ahead, it started with 1, Prall said. His voice was flat. The voice of someone who had been holding a thing for a long time and was tired of the wait. "1 soldier. He came to me 16 months ago, maybe a little more. He'd failed the precision evaluation twice. He was going to be reassigned out of the combat track he'd been working toward for 3 years. He offered me money." He paused. I said no. But Krause said, "But he came back a week later, and the number was different." He stopped. Looked at the table. I said yes. "How many times after that?" 11 total. Over 14 months. Not all at once. There were months where nobody came. And then someone would, and I knew the number would be enough. He stopped again. I told myself it was rare enough that it didn't matter. That one borderline soldier getting a pass didn't change the operational picture. That's what I told myself. Krause let the silence sit for a moment. "Soldier Pemrick," he said. The name of one of the 4. "Was his score one of yours?" Prall's jaw tightened. "Yes. He died in Keswick Province 8 months ago. His unit cited insufficient precision capacity as a factor in the engagement outcome." Prall didn't respond. He was looking at a point about 6 inches in front of him that had nothing in it. "Soldier Fenwick," Krause said. "Soldier Anaya, Soldier Thrace." He read each name evenly, without accusation in the tone, which was somehow worse than accusation would have been. Just the names. Just the fact of them. In the monitoring room, Nora watched Prall sit with those names. She had read their files. She knew their ages, their hometowns, their service histories. Pemrick had been 26, from a small city in the Eastern Plains, and had been 2 years into a service track that his family had said in his memorial record was everything he'd wanted since he was 14 years old. Fenwick had been 31, married, 2 children. Anaya had been the only woman in her unit's precision assignment group and had been described by her commanding officer as the most tenacious soldier he'd worked with in a decade. Thrace had been 23. Prahl had taken money 11 times, and 4 people were dead. She closed the laptop. She sat in the small monitoring room alone for a while, not writing anything, not doing anything, just sitting with the weight of the afternoon, which was considerable, and which she had learned over many years to simply let be heavy, rather than trying to manage it into something smaller than it was. Voss found her at 5:40, which she hadn't expected. She was outside, at the far edge of the range parking area, not for any particular reason except that it was the only place on the installation right now where nobody was looking at her, and she had needed that for approximately the last hour. She was sitting on a concrete barrier with her tablet in her hands, but the screen dark, and the evening light was doing the thing it did over terrain like this, stretching everything long and flat and gold-edged, which was briefly very beautiful and then very cold. Voss came across the parking area with the gait of a man who was uncertain of his reception and had decided to walk toward it anyway, which she noted because it was different from his morning gait. He stopped about 3 feet away and didn't sit. "They told me you'd be out here," he said. "Who's they?" "Adkins," he said. "He's been asking about you all afternoon." He paused. "The kid thinks you hung the moon, for what it's worth. He should focus on his actual evaluation," she said. "The malfunction will be noted, and his score will be reviewed. He'll get a clean assessment." "That's all you have to say about that?" "What else would I say?" Voss was quiet for a moment. He looked out across the range, the long, empty corridor of it, the targets just visible at distance in the evening light. He had the expression of someone who has spent a day having very specific ideas about himself revised. "I want to ask you something," he said. "Go ahead." "This morning, when I pushed the distances," he stopped. "Did you know then about Prahl, about all of it, and you were just waiting for the right moment?" Nora looked at him. She thought about giving him the manageable version of the answer and decided he'd earned the real one. "I knew before this morning," she said. "What I didn't know was whether there was one person involved or more than one, whether it was Prahl alone or whether someone above him had authorized it or benefited from it." The implication of what she hadn't said sat clearly in the air between them. Voss's jaw tightened. "And now I believe it was Prahl alone," she said. "The financial records support that. His interviews support that." Voss breathed out. It was not a relieved sound. It was the sound of a man absorbing the fact that he'd been cleared of something he hadn't known he was being evaluated for. "I pushed you on that range," he said. "I pushed a captain in the middle of an active investigation because I thought you were a nurse who needed to be put in her place." "Yes," she said. "You did, I'm sorry." He said it without the cushioning people usually put around apologies, no, because or but or qualifications. Just the 2 words, standing on their own. Nora looked at the range, the targets, the long flat distances between them. "Apologies are noted," she said. "What matters now is what you do with the training program when this is over. You're going to be the one who has to rebuild it." He looked at her. "You think they'll keep me here?" "I think if you handle the next 30 days correctly, you'll have the opportunity to become the kind of leader you weren't this morning." She stood up from the concrete barrier and picked up her tablet. "That's worth more than anything you lost today." She walked past him toward the administrative annex. She had reports to finalize and a secure upload to complete before midnight. And she was tired in the specific way that this kind of work made you tired, not the clean exhaustion of physical effort, but the complicated, layered fatigue of having spent hours in a room full of consequences. She was halfway across the parking area when her phone buzzed with a message from Krause. She stopped and read it. Then she read it again. The message was 4 lines long, and it contained a name she had not seen in any of the financial records, the Scorsel logs, or the documentation she had assembled over 6 weeks, and the name belonged to someone who was not Prahl, and who was not any of the 11 soldiers who had paid for inflated scores. It was a different kind of name entirely. It was the name of a person who had been, according to a document that Krause's team had just pulled from a secondary financial pathway that had taken all afternoon to trace, receiving a percentage. Not from the soldiers, from Prahl, a cut, a regular one. 14 months of it, which meant Prahl had not been alone. Nora stood in the parking area with the evening going dark around her and read the name a 3rd time and thought about all the conversations she'd had that afternoon and all the people who had been in that briefing room and exactly who among them had been sitting at the table when she had described, in precise detail, everything her investigation had found. The wind came across the range in the same gust and drop pattern it had all day. She put the phone in her pocket and turned around. She put the phone in her pocket and turned around. Krause picked up on the second ring. "The name in your message," she said. "Where did it come from?" "Secondary financial trace." His voice had the particular compression of someone who had been staring at numbers for hours and had just watched them form a shape they hadn't expected. Prahl was receiving deposits from 6 different soldiers across the 14 months. We already knew that. What we missed in the initial pull was a 7th account, not a soldier's account. A civilian routing number attached to a holding registration. Registered to who? "The registration is under a shell entity," Krause said. "But the beneficial owner documentation, which took us 4 hours to get through the financial compliance office, has a name on it." "Hargrove," she said. Silence. "How did you know?" he said. "He was in the briefing room this afternoon when I described exactly how Prahl was exploiting the scoring window," she said. "He asked the right questions. The kind of questions you ask when you already know the answer, and you're trying to find out how much we know. That's not evidence." "No," she said. "The 14 months of percentage payments is evidence. I need everything you have on the account, transaction history, amounts, dates. I need to know if the amounts track against Prahl's intake timeline." She heard Krause typing. "I'm sending it now." Her phone buzzed. She opened the document, while still holding the phone to her ear, and scanned the transaction history with the rapid, practiced movement of someone who has read financial records in field conditions, before in bad light, under pressure, with limited time. The amounts tracked. Not exactly. There was a lag of 3 to 5 days between Prahl's deposits and the outgoing transfers to the shell account, which meant the cut was being skimmed after the fact, not prearranged per transaction, which meant Hargrove was collecting his percentage passively, which meant he had set up the mechanism and then stepped back far enough that his fingerprints were not on any individual transaction. It was a careful structure, careful enough that someone had designed it deliberately. "He's been planning an exit," she said. If the investigation had stopped at Prahl, Hargrove's account would have looked like an unrelated holding. The shell entity has legitimate business filings. It would have taken another 2 weeks to trace without the compliance pull. "We have it now," Krause said. "Does Taft know?" "I'm calling her after you." "Call her now," Nora said. "Before you do anything else. Hargrove is still on the installation. He was in that briefing room 3 hours ago, and he heard everything I said about what we have. If he understands the financial trace is moving, he'll run," Krause said. "Or he'll do something worse than run," she said. "Call Taft." She hung up and stood in the dark parking area and thought very quickly and specifically about what she knew and what that knowledge required of her in the next 10 minutes. Hargrove was the deputy commander of Harrow Peak. He had an office in the command building. He had clearance to access the installation's secure filing systems, its communications infrastructure, and its vehicle pool. He had the rank to move through the installation without being questioned, and he had been sitting in a room 3 hours ago, listening to a precise account of where the investigation currently stood. The question was not whether he would act. The question was what action was available to him that he could complete before Taft had formal authorization to detain him. Nora walked, not running. Running drew attention, and attention right now was a resource she was not ready to spend. She reached the command building's east entrance at 5:58. The evening had gone properly dark by then, the installation's perimeter lighting, creating the specific orange-gray landscape of a military base after hours functional, flat, deeply familiar to anyone who has spent time inside one. The command building's entrance had a keycard reader and a staffed security desk. The guard on duty, a young specialist named Reyes, who had nodded at her a handful of times in 6 weeks without ever learning her name, looked up when she came through the door. "Nursing staff isn't usually in the command building after hours," Reyes said. "Not hostile. Just stating." "I'm not nursing staff," Nora said. She put her authorization card on the desk, not the Ward C staff badge. The other one, the one that had been in her locked case for 6 weeks and was now, as of Taft's 3 o'clock declaration, her active identification. Captain Calloway, P'd. "I need to know if Deputy Commander Hargrove is still in the building." Reyes looked at the card, looked at her scrubs, looked at the card again. "Ma'am," he said slowly, his key card last registered at he checked the screen. 1742. East Corridor, Level 2. 16 minutes ago. Still in the building. "Is there a vehicle pool request logged under his name tonight?" Reyes checked. "No, ma'am. Communications room is at staff. Sergeant Hollis is on the overnight shift, started at 1700. "Thank you," she said, and moved. Level 2 of the command building was administrative offices, the secure records room, a conference that was dark at this hour, a corridor that ran the length of the building and connected to the communications annex at the far end. The lighting was reduced to overnight mode, functional but dim, the kind of light that makes distances look longer than they are. She found Hargrove in the secure records room. He was at a terminal. He was not logging out, he was copying. She could see the transfer interface on the screen from the doorway, the progress bar moving across it, the file directory open to a location in the installation's administrative server that housed the investigation documentation that Taft's team had uploaded during the afternoon. He was copying the investigation file. He heard her in the doorway and turned, and for a moment neither of them said anything. She took in his expression, not guilt, exactly, but the specific recalculation she'd seen on the range that morning on Voss's face, the moment when someone who has been operating on one understanding of a situation suddenly has to operate on another. Hargrove was faster about it than Voss had been. "Captain," he said, "I was just reviewing the materials from this afternoon's briefing." "The briefing materials are in a read-only directory," she said. "That's a transfer interface." He looked at the screen and then back at her, with the expression of a man deciding whether to sustain an obvious lie or move to something more durable. He moved. "You should understand," he said, "that what you're looking at is considerably more complicated than what your investigation file says it is." "Tell me how it's complicated." "The qualification program has systemic failures," he said, "not individual ones. The funding allocation for legitimate remediation training has been diverted at a level above this installation for 2 years. What Prahl was doing, what I helped structure, was a response to a broken system. Soldiers were failing evaluations because the training resources to actually prepare them had been cut. The qualification scores were a workaround." She looked at him. 4 soldiers died. 4 soldiers died because of operational command decisions that had nothing to do with their qualification levels, he said. "I've read the field reports. You're attributing a causal chain that the evidence doesn't support." "The evidence I have supports it," she said. "The evidence I have is 14 months of financial transfers between a holding account in your name and Range Officer Prahl's personal account." Something shifted in his expression. Recalculation again, but different this time, not deciding which version of a story to tell, but assessing. "That account," he said, "is going to be very difficult to explain to your colonel without the context that I have spent 2 years developing." "Try explaining it to her yourself," Nora said. "She's been notified. She's on her way here." It was a guess. It was an accurate guess, because Krause was efficient and Taft was decisive, but it was still a guess, and she delivered it without the register of a guess. Hargrove stood up from the terminal. He was taller than she was by about 8 inches and had the physical confidence of someone who had spent a career in rooms where that difference mattered. "I'm going to close this transfer," he said, "and I'm going to go to my office, and I'm going to contact my legal counsel, and I would suggest you let that happen." "I'd suggest you don't touch that terminal again," she said. He stopped. "The transfer is partial," she said. "Whatever you've copied is now part of the chain of evidence. Adding more files to it doesn't help you. It just adds counts." She kept her voice flat and specific, the voice she used when the only tool available was information. "You can stop now, and that's one thing. You can keep going, and that's a different thing. Your legal counsel is going to tell you the same." He looked at the terminal. He looked at her. Stepped away from the terminal. She crossed the room and manually suspended the transfer interface, made a note of what had been copied and what the copyist status was, and then turned back to Hargrove and said, "Sit down, please." He sat. Not because she had compelled him. She had no formal detention authority in this room right now, a fact she was acutely aware of, but because the specific quality of her certainty had done something that physical size couldn't counter. She had said "sit down" in the voice of someone who already knew how this ended, and he had believed her. It took Taft 11 minutes to arrive. They were 11 very long minutes in which Hargrove said nothing, and Nora said nothing, and the secure records room was quiet except for the building's ventilation system and the distant, muffled sound of the installation going about its evening routine outside the windows. She stood by the terminal and he sat in the chair, and they waited. What happened after Taft arrived was procedurally specific and not particularly dramatic. Hargrove was formally advised of the IG investigation's expanded scope. He was accompanied, not escorted under guard, which would have required a formal detention order that was not yet in place, but accompanied, which amounted to the same thing, to a monitored holding space in the command building. His access credentials were suspended. His communications were placed under monitoring authorization. The transfer he had partially completed was logged as evidence. By 8 o'clock, the investigation file at Harrow Peak had grown from 1 subject to 2, and the legal complexity of what was in front of Krause's team had roughly doubled. Nora was in the administrative annex when Taft found her at 8:20, and Taft had the particular exhaustion of a senior officer who has had a day that reconfigured itself 3 times. Hargrove is asking to give a statement, Taft said. He wants to characterize the arrangement with Prahl as a systemic reform measure. Is there any truth to the funding diversion claim? Taft was quiet for a moment. There are budget records showing a reduction in remediation training allocation. It's real. It doesn't justify what he did, and it doesn't explain the money, but it's not fabricated. He's going to use it, Nora said. His counsel will, Taft said. Yes. It complicates the narrative, Nora said. Not the evidence, the narrative. He's going to argue that the financial transfers were compensation for risk taken in an unofficial corrective program. Can he make that argument credibly? Nora thought about the transaction amounts, the holding account structure, the 3 to 5 day lag. He can make it, she said. It won't survive the financial forensics. The amounts don't reflect risk compensation, they reflect a percentage. A consistent one. Nobody compensating themselves for systemic reform takes a consistent cut. That's a business model. Taft nodded. The forensic team will get there. Make sure they look at the lag interval specifically, Nora said. The timing is the evidence of intent. He wasn't reimbursing himself after the fact. He was collecting a fee. I'll make sure they know. Taft paused. You should go rest. You've been going since before 6 this morning. I have reports to finalize. The reports will hold until morning. The records Hargrove partially copied won't, Nora said. I need to document exactly what the transfer captured before the chain of evidence on that file gets complicated by multiple hands. Taft looked at her with the expression she'd had in the small windowless office that afternoon, the slightly open door. Is there anything you actually let wait? Nora thought about it honestly. Not usually, she said. It's a problem. It was not the kind of admission she typically made. She'd made it because she was tired, and because Taft had earned it, and also because it happened to be true in a way that, at 8:20 on an evening like this one, she didn't feel like pretending otherwise. She went back to the reports. It was past 10 when Corporal Adkins knocked on the door of the small office she'd borrowed in the administrative annex. She had been expecting Krause or one of his team. She had not been expecting the corporal, who was standing in the doorway in off-duty clothes, looking like he'd been debating this particular walk for at least 30 minutes. I know you're busy, he said. It's all right. Come in. He came in but didn't sit. He stood with his hands in his pockets, a posture she recognized as someone who was about to say something they'd decided to say, and was managing the difficulty of actually saying it. I talked to some of the others, he said. From this morning's evaluation, soldiers who were in that session. She waited. There's a name, he said. A soldier who was in last quarter's evaluation. He qualified at the expert tier precision assignment track, but he and I trained together for 8 months before that, and I know how he shoots, and he does not shoot expert tier. Nora set down her pen. His name, Specialist Varden, Adkins said. He deployed 6 weeks ago. Precision support role in the Keswick Corridor. The Keswick Corridor was where Pemrick had died. She looked at Adkins carefully. He was 22 years old, and he had walked down here past 10 o'clock to give her a name, which meant he understood what giving her the name might mean for the person it belonged to. You understand what you're telling me, she said. Yes, ma'am. He wasn't calling her ma'am because of her rank. She suspected he still wasn't entirely certain about her rank. He was calling her that because the situation had graduated to something that required it. Vardan may have paid for his score, she said, or he may have been one of the soldiers who genuinely failed and was recorded incorrectly without his knowledge. I need you to be specific. Any conversations, anything he said about the evaluation afterward that was inconsistent. Adkins was quiet for a moment. He told me the evaluation was easier than he expected, he said. The way he said it, it wasn't a complaint. It was almost relieved. That was a different quality of information. It was not proof, but it was the kind of detail that directed the next question in a financial record. Thank you, she said. You did the right thing. He nodded. He stood there a moment longer, with the posture of someone who has more to say, but is uncertain whether it belongs in the conversation. The 4 soldiers, he said. The ones who died.
Yes.
Were their families told that the scores were... No, she said. Not yet. That's part of what this process will determine: the formal notification, the official record correction. It has to be done in the right sequence, or it gets complicated in ways that hurt rather than help. They deserve to know, he said. It was quiet and specific and had nothing defensive in it, just a fact he was stating. They do, she said. And they will. He nodded one more time and left. and she listened to his footsteps go down the corridor, and then she picked up her pen and wrote Vardan's name in her notes and circled it, and set the pen down again, and pressed her hand flat against the desk for a moment. She was tired. Not the complicated fatigue from earlier, something simpler and heavier, the kind of tired that comes from caring about the right things for a long time. She let herself have 30 seconds of it. Then she picked up the pen. At 11:40, Krause called. Prahl finished his full statement, he said. He confirmed Hargrove's involvement, not as a systemic reform architect, as a partner. His account is that Hargrove approached him with the arrangement approximately 2 months into Prahl's own scheme. Prahl had already taken 2 payments. Hargrove found out, and instead of reporting it, he proposed a cut. So Hargrove didn't initiate it, he parasitized it. That's Prahl's account. Which one does the financial record support? The timeline in Prahl's account matches the transaction record, Krause said. The first transfer to Hargrove's shell account occurs 8 weeks after Prahl's first intake, which meant Hargrove had identified a subordinate's criminal activity and leveraged it for personal gain instead of reporting it. That was not one crime. That was a sequence of decisions, each one deliberate, each one compounding. And it meant that Hargrove had been in a position to stop the entire scheme at the 8-week mark, before 10 of the 11 inflated qualifications, before any of the 4 deaths. Nora processed that. He could have stopped it, she said. Yes. She let the silence hold for a moment. Does Taft have what she needs for the formal detention order? She's filing it now. He'll be formally detained tonight, transferred to the JAG holding facility at Denton Base by OSO 700. Nora looked at her notes, at Vardan's circled name. There's a deployed soldier I need a status check on, she said. Specialist Vardan, currently in the Keswick corridor. I need to know his exact assignment parameters, and whether there's a mechanism to flag his qualification records for urgent command review without tipping off his unit's briefing chain. That's an operational request, Krause said. That has to go through Taft. I know. I need you to get me in front of her before midnight. She's processing the detention order. Tell her it's about the Keswick corridor, Nora said. She'll make time. She was right. Taft made time. At 12:15 in the morning, Nora sat across from Taft in the same small windowless office where the day had properly begun. The folding table, the 4 chairs, the water pitcher, which was finally empty, and she laid out what Adkins had told her and what it meant and what the urgency was. Taft listened. She had the focused attention of someone running on less sleep than was advisable, making decisions that required more clarity than exhaustion usually allowed. The Keswick Corridor Command has a review cycle on the 23rd, Taft said. That's 4 days. 4 days is too long if Vardan is in a precision support role with a qualification that doesn't match his actual capability, Nora said. The operational risk is specific. I can't pull a deployed soldier's assignment on the basis of a corporal's anecdotal assessment. No, Nora said. But you can flag his qualification record for emergency audit review, which triggers a mandatory command briefing at his deployment site without requiring you to specify the reason. The briefing process itself will prompt his unit command to reassess his current tasking. Taft looked at her. That's a creative reading of the audit flag mechanism. It's an accurate one. Taft was quiet for a moment. Outside, somewhere on the installation, a vehicle moved across the perimeter road, just the sound of tires on gravel, brief and then gone. I'll file the audit flag in the morning, Taft said. First cycle. Thank you. You should sleep, Taft said. After I finish the Hargrove file documentation. Calloway. Taft's voice had a quality that was not quite maternal and not quite command authority, something in between. The documentation will be there in the morning. Vardan will be there in the morning too, Nora said. The documentation gets done first. She meant it. Taft could see she meant it and chose not to spend any more of the evening's limited reserves arguing with someone who was simply going to keep working regardless. Nora went back to the office and back to the reports, and the installation went quiet around her. And somewhere in the Keswick corridor, 400 miles from Harrow Peak, in terrain she had studied on maps but never seen, a specialist named Vardan was moving through an assignment that his actual skills may not have prepared him for, and the night had several hours left in it, and she worked through all of them. She was finalizing the last section of the Hargrove documentation at 3:47 when her secure channel pinged. She opened it expecting Krause with a status update on the detention transfer. It was not Krause. The message was flagged from the Keswick Corridor Deployment Command, a senior field officer she had never communicated with directly, whose name she recognized from the operational files attached to Pemrick's case. The timestamp was 3:41, 6 minutes ago. The message was 4 sentences. She read it once. She read it again. because her brain did the thing it did sometimes when a piece of information was worse than expected, tried to find a different reading, looked for an error in parsing, tested the syntax for ambiguity. There was no ambiguity. Specialist Varden's unit had been assigned to a precision support role in a corridor engagement that had begun at 2200 hours local time. The engagement had escalated beyond initial parameters. Vardan had been positioned as the precision element, and his unit's field commander, upon discovering at the engagement's opening that Vardin was not performing at the qualification level his record indicated, had requested emergency support, but the request had gone through a communication node that was currently experiencing a relay fault, and the request was delayed, and the engagement was live, and Vardin was the precision element, and he was not qualified for what he was being asked to do. Nora was already reaching for her phone before she'd consciously decided to move. She was already reaching for her phone before she'd consciously decided to move. Taft picked up in 2 rings. Keswick, Nora said. Vardin's unit is in an active engagement. He's the precision element, and his command just figured out he can't perform at his recorded qualification level. The support request went through a faulted relay node. It's delayed. I don't know by how much. Silence. The specific silence of someone absorbing information and making decisions simultaneously. Where's the message from? Taft said. Senior Field Officer, Keswick Corridor Deployment Command, flagged through the secure channel. Timestamp 3:41. That's 6 minutes ago, 7 now. I need the relay fault location. If the support request is stuck in a node fault, we can push it through a secondary routing. The sound of movement. Taft was already on her feet. Forward me the message, everything in it. Nora forwarded it before Taft finished the sentence. I'm calling the Keswick Corridor Operations Desk, Taft said. Stay on your secure channel. The line went quiet but didn't disconnect. Nora could hear Taft moving, another call opening, the compressed and specific language of senior command, making contact with a field operations desk at nearly 4 in the morning. She sat at the desk in the small borrowed office and looked at the forwarded message still open on her screen and did the math on what she knew. Varden had been positioned as precision support at 2200 hours local time. Keswick Corridor was in a time zone 2 hours ahead of Harrow Peak, which meant the engagement had been active for approximately 3 hours and 40 minutes before his field commander discovered the qualification gap and requested support. 3 hours and 40 minutes of a precision element performing below the capability his record indicated he had. She thought about the nature of a precision support role in a corridor engagement. She thought about what it meant when the precision element went unreliable mid-engagement, not just tactically, but for the people around him, the soldiers whose movement and positioning depended on the precision element performing its function. She had read enough field debrief reports in the last 700 miles to understand exactly what that gap looked like from inside an engagement. She was still thinking about it when Taft came back on the line. The relay fault is at the node junction between Keswick Forward Command and the Regional Support Dispatch, Taft said. Her voice was clipped and precise. Maintenance was aware of a degraded signal issue and had flagged it for repair in the next 48 hours. Nobody escalated it. Can you push the support request through secondary routing? Already done. The Keswick Regional Support Command has been contacted directly. They're activating a qualified precision SESET from their reserve deployment roster. A pause. It's going to take time. Keswick Corridor is not a short transit. How much time? Taft told her. Nora looked at the desk, at her notes. At Varden's circled name, the engagement timeline, she said. Do we know the scope? Field assessments at corridor engagements of this type run between 4 and 7 hours from initial contact, Taft said. Depending on how it moves. 4 to 7 hours. The support asset would arrive at the outside edge of that window. Maybe inside it, maybe not. There's nothing else to do from here, Taft said. It was not a statement of resignation. It was a fact being stated to someone who needed to hear it clearly. The field command on the ground has the information. They've adjusted their deployment. The support is en route. We have done what can be done from here. I know, Nora said. Do you? She looked at the empty water pitcher on the corner of the desk. Someone had set it there and not moved it, and now it was just a thing in a room. Yes, she said. Try to sleep, Taft said. I'll notify you the moment I hear anything from Keswick. The line disconnected. Nora sat in the quiet office and did not sleep. The notification came at 6:12 in the morning. She was awake, had been awake when it came, sitting in the same position she'd occupied most of the night. The Hargrove documentation long since finalized, her notes reorganized twice, the transfer evidence logged and cross-referenced and attached to the chain of custody in the formal record. There was nothing left to work on. She had run out of work at around 5:15 and had simply sat after that, which was its own kind of miserable. Taft's message was brief. Keswick corridor engagement concluded at 0540 local time. Specialist Varden's unit sustained 2 injuries, neither fatal. Varden was retrieved from the precision position and replaced by the activated reserve asset at the 3-hour mark of the engagement. Unit Command has filed a full after-action report, citing qualification record discrepancy as a material factor in the engagement's complications. 2 injuries, neither fatal. She read it 3 times the way she'd read the previous message, but this time what she was looking for was different. This time she was looking for the gap between the worst version and the actual version, and the gap existed, and she let herself register that it existed before she moved on to what the after-action report meant and what it required. What it required was a paper trail that connected a specific field engagement's complications to a specific set of falsified qualification records at a specific installation, compiled by a specific range officer, facilitated by a specific deputy commander, over a specific period of 14 months. The after-action report from Keswick was that paper trail. Combined with the financial records, Prahl's full statement, the scoring documentation Nora had assembled over 6 weeks, and the transaction history from Hargrove's shell account, it created a chain of causation that went from 1 man taking money to 2 soldiers bleeding in a corridor 400 miles away. She wrote that down. She wrote all of it down in the specific structured language of an investigative summary, because that summary was going to matter. At 7:30, Hargrove was transferred. She watched from the administrative annex window. 2 JAG transport officers, a vehicle with Denton base markings, Hargrove in civilian clothes, because no one had offered him a change of uniform, and he had not asked. He walked to the vehicle with the posture of a man who had spent the night deciding how to carry himself through something like this, and had landed on a version of dignity that was about 60% convincing. He didn't look toward the annex window. She hadn't expected him to. Prahl had been transferred 2 hours earlier, in a separate vehicle, which was standard procedure, and also tactically sensible, given that the 2 men's legal situations were about to intersect in ways that made it better for everyone if they arrived at separate facilities. Voss was still on the installation. He had not been detained. He was technically on administrative review pending investigation, which meant he was confined to quarters a large step down from operational authority, but not a cell. She had heard through Krause that Voss had spent the night cooperating fully with the IG team, and that his cooperation was consistent with his actual ignorance of the scheme, rather than the performative ignorance of someone managing their exposure. That mattered. It didn't undo the morning on the range his dismissal of her, the way he'd performed for his unit, the accumulation of small and large assumptions he'd made about what she was. But it was different from what Hargrove had done with his awareness, and the law and her report were both going to need to reflect that difference, clearly. She turned away from the window when the JAG-A vehicle pulled through the installation gate. Krause was in the doorway. "You've been here all night," he said. "Yes. The documentation is complete? Hargrove file, Prahl file, the Varden-Keswick addendum, and the preliminary causation summary linking the qualification falsification scheme to the Keswick engagement complications." She picked up the stack of printed reports from the desk. She still preferred paper for the documents that mattered most. It was a holdover from training environments where screens failed and paper didn't. Everything is also uploaded to the secure channel in triplicate. He took the stack with the expression of someone who has worked alongside people like her before and knows better than to comment on the hours. "Colonel Taft wants a full team briefing at 0900, he said. "All IG personnel, installation senior staff, and the legal representatives for both detained subjects." "Who's representing Hargrove?" "Civilian counsel came in from Alderman City overnight. Military counsel is being assigned through the JAG office." "Prahl? Military counsel only. He's asked the IG team to note in the formal record that his cooperation has been complete and without condition." Nora thought about Prahl in the interview room the night before, the flat voice, the names, the look at a 0.6 inches in front of him that had nothing in it. "Note that the cooperation began after he'd already been confronted with the financial record," she said. "That's relevant to the completeness characterization." "It's already noted," Krause said. He paused. "Calloway, you look like you've been awake for 22 hours. 23, she said. "I'm fine. There's food in the command building common room. The briefing is 90 minutes away." She went, not because she was hungry, particularly, but because Krause had the expression of someone who would follow up about the food, and she had enough things to manage without that being one of them. The 9 o'clock briefing lasted 2 hours and 20 minutes. It covered the formal charges being filed against Prawl, against Hargrove, against 4 of the 11 soldiers whose payments had been verified through the financial record and whose cooperation in the investigation was being factored into the charging decisions. The 7 remaining soldiers were being assessed individually. Several appeared in the records not as buyers but as victim soldiers whose actual failures had been recorded incorrectly without their knowledge, likely because Prawl had at some point found it easier to falsify scores broadly rather than selectively. The legal representatives were there for the charging portion and then were asked to leave. What remained after they left was a smaller meeting. Taft, Krause, 2 senior legal advisors, the installation's medical director, and Nora, and what that meeting addressed was more difficult. The 4 deceased soldiers, Taft said, Pemrick, Fenwick, Anaya, Thrace. Their families have not been notified of the qualification falsification. They have received standard casualty notification and the field debrief explanations that their unit commands provided at the time of death. She looked at the table. Those explanations are now, in light of what we know, incomplete. They're inaccurate, the senior legal advisor said. His name was Colonel Rasmussen, JAG Division, and he had the careful language of someone whose entire professional life required precision in word choice. The casualty reports attributed the engagement outcomes to tactical factors. Those reports will need to be amended. The families deserve the amendment, Nora said. Not a bureaucratic one, not a letter from a records office. Someone needs to sit with each family and explain what actually happened and why, and what is being done about it. Rasmussen looked at her. That's a significant undertaking. Yes, she said. It is. Who do you propose conducts those notifications? She had thought about this during the parts of the night when there was no work left to do. She had thought about Adkins standing in the doorway, saying they deserved to know in that quiet, factual way. She had thought about Pemrich being 26 and from a small city in the Eastern Plains. Someone who has read their files, she said. Someone who understands what the falsification meant in operational terms and can explain it without bureaucratic abstraction. And someone with enough rank that the families understand the military is taking responsibility rather than managing liability. She didn't volunteer herself for it explicitly. She didn't need to. The room understood what she was proposing. Taft looked at her for a long moment. I'll authorize it, she said, after the formal charges are filed and the legal records are established. The notifications happen with the backing of a complete formal record, not ahead of it. Agreed, Nora said. 2 weeks, Taft said. 3 at the outside. It was longer than Nora wanted. It was shorter than the families had already waited. The formal charges against Hargrove were filed at 1400. Nora was not in the room when it happened. She was at that point finally doing what Taft and Krause and everyone else had been telling her to do since the previous evening's sleeping. In the medical staff quarters, in her room, in the bed that had a locked case underneath it that now held her Ward C badge instead of her authorization card. She slept for 4 hours. She woke up feeling the way 4 hours of sleep after 23 hours of consciousness produces functional but not recovered. The way a patched-over thing is functional but still shows the patch. She checked her secure channel. She read the charging documents that had been shared to her access level. She read through the formal structure of what had been filed against Hargrove and cross-referenced it against what she knew, and confirmed that everything she had documented was represented in the charges not perfectly, not in the exact language she would have chosen, but completely. Nothing was missing. Nothing had been softened into irrelevance. Falsifying official military records, fraud. Misconduct in a position of command authority. Gross negligence resulting in loss of life. 4 counts, 1 for each name. An accessory to the sale of military qualifications, which was a charge that Rasmussen's team had constructed carefully and specifically, and that would carry its own sentencing considerations. She read the 4 names in the charging document. Pemrick, Fenwick, Anaya, Thrace. In a legal filing, their names were attached to a count of gross negligence. It was cold language for something that had been a human disaster, but it was also the language that would follow Hargrove into every legal proceeding from this point forward. And that was what those names deserved to be present in every room where Hargrove faced what he had done, not as abstractions, but as count-specific and named and permanent. She closed the document. She got up and washed her face and changed into clothes that weren't scrubs for the first time in 2 days, and she went to find Voss. He was in his administrative quarters, which were comfortable by military standards and currently had the atmosphere of a place where a person had been sitting alone with a great deal of time to think. He looked up when she knocked on the open door, and the expression on his face was not the expression he'd had on the range, not the public performance of command authority, but something more tired and more real. "You should probably sit," she said. He sat. She sat across from him. "The charges against Hargrove were filed this afternoon," she said. "You'll receive the formal notification through administrative channels, but I wanted to tell you directly, because what happens next at Harrow Peak affects your situation." "My situation," he said. "You're on administrative review. The IG team's assessment of your role is complete. You had no knowledge of the scheme, no financial involvement, and no opportunity to observe the falsification given how Prahl managed the documentation." She said it plainly, without softening or amplifying. "The administrative review will close with a finding of no culpability." He was quiet for a moment, but the review will also note your conduct in the field generally," she said, "including your conduct yesterday morning." He nodded once. He'd been expecting this, the evaluation extensions, the non-standard distances. "You pushed a range evaluation beyond its authorized parameters for personal reasons," she said. "That's documented. It will be in the record." She paused. "It won't end your career, but it's there." He looked at his hands. Big hands. The hands of someone who had spent a long time being the person who decided things. "I mocked you," he said, in front of the unit. "I thought you were. I thought it was obvious what you were. You thought I was a nurse. I thought you were something that could be dismissed," he said. "That's what I thought." She didn't respond to that directly. "The training program here needs to be rebuilt," she said. "The evaluation structure, the oversight mechanisms, the chain of documentation review. That's a significant undertaking, and it needs someone with range authority who understands what went wrong." He looked at her. "You're suggesting me." "I'm noting that you have the institutional knowledge and the rank to do it," she said. "What you do with that is your choice. After everything. After everything, the question is what comes next," she said. "That's always the question." He was quiet for a long time. Outside his quarters window, the installation was going through its late afternoon routines movement. Vehicle sounds, the distant sound of the range being unlocked for a limited training session that Taft had authorized for units not involved in the investigation. "The 4 soldiers," he said. "I knew their names. Pemrich, I knew him. He came through Harrow Peak 18 months ago. He was good. Genuinely good." He stopped. "I signed off on his combat deployment. I looked at his qualification tier and I signed off." "You signed off on a record that was falsified," she said. "I should have looked harder." "Yes," she said. "You should have. It was not a comfort. It was not meant to be. It was what it was, which was true, and he was the kind of person who needed the true version more than the managed one." He nodded. She stood. "The administrative review closes in 48 hours, she said. "After that, you'll have a conversation with Colonel Taft about what your role here looks like going forward." She paused at the door. "I'd recommend you have a clear answer ready." She left him with the window and the late afternoon light and the sound of the installation running without him in it. The public dimension of the case broke 4 days later. Not through a press release, which Rasmussen's office had been carefully preparing, but through a leak, the kind of leak that happens in large institutions, when information touches enough people that containment becomes probabilistic rather than certain. Someone in the administrative chain talked to someone outside it, and by the time the official disclosure went out, the broad shape of what had happened at Harrow Peak was already in a military affairs publication that Nora read on her phone in the hallway outside Taft's office. The article was incomplete and had 2 significant factual errors, but the core of it was accurate. A range officer at a military medical installation had been falsifying marksmanship qualification scores for money, with the complicity of a senior officer, and soldiers had died. The errors were about the timeline and about Nora's role. The article described her as a whistleblower nurse, which was both inaccurate and, she thought, somewhat funny in a way that the situation did not particularly earn. Taft was less amused. "They're going to want a statement," Taft said. "The Military Affairs Desk and at least 2 other publications have already requested comment." "The legal office handles the statement," Nora said. "The legal office will handle the official statement. The unofficial version who actually uncovered this. What the investigation looked like. That's already being assembled from whatever sources the article used." Taft looked at her. "Your name is going to be in print." "My name is already in the charging documents," Nora said, "which are public record. Your actual rank and assignment are not. They will be." Taft was quiet. "How do you feel about that?" Nora thought about the question honestly, because Taft was asking it honestly. "It doesn't change anything," she said. "The work was the work, whether someone prints my name next to it or not." Some people want the recognition, Taft said. There's nothing wrong with that. Some people need the undercover assignment to keep working, Nora said. Once my name is publicly attached to this, my ability to walk into an installation as a ward nurse is limited. Is that a concern? It's a consideration, Nora said, not a grief. Taft looked at her with the slightly open-door expression. You're going to get a commendation, she said, formally. That's not a question. I know. Do you have a preference for how it's structured? Nora looked at the window, the installation visible beyond it, the range in the distance, the long, flat corridor of it empty in the morning light. I'd like the commendation documentation to name the 4 soldiers, she said. Specifically, Pemrick, Fenwick, Anaya, Thrace, not in a supporting clause. In the primary citation, Taft was quiet. This isn't about me, Nora said. It never was. I know that, Taft said. That's why you're getting the commendation. The court-martial proceedings began 12 days after Hargrove's transfer to Denton Base. Nora was present for the opening session, not as a witness, not yet, but as the investigating officer of record, which required her presence in the chamber for the formal reading of charges. She sat in the observer section in her uniform, the first time most of the people in that room had seen her in anything other than scrubs, and she watched Hargrove stand while the charges were read. He looked smaller than he had in the installation. It was something she'd noticed before in proceedings like this, not that the institution shrank people, exactly, but that the removal from their operational context revealed something about how much of their size had been borrowed from the position rather than generated internally. Hargrove's civilian counsel entered a not guilty plea on his behalf. The not guilty plea, Rasmussen had explained to her, was expected and was not an indication that the defense believed it could prevail. It was a procedural position from which negotiations could be conducted. The financial record was clear. Prahl's testimony was clear. The Keswick after-action report was clear. The defense's actual work would be in the sentencing phase, not the guilt determination. When the charges were read, all of them, including the 4 counts of gross negligence, Hargrove looked at the table in front of him. Not at his counsel, not at the judges, at the table. She watched his face for the moment when the 4th name was read. Thrace. Something happened in his jaw, a tightening that was probably involuntary. She noted it the way she noted everything, not with satisfaction, exactly, but with the recognition that it was real, that he was carrying the weight of those names even if he would spend the next several months trying to argue around them. The weight was there. She could see it. That mattered. Prahl's proceedings moved faster. He had entered a cooperating plea, and the sentencing recommendation from the JAG office reflected the cooperation not generously, but accurately. The cooperation had value. It had value because it had helped establish Hargrove's involvement and had allowed the investigation to move quickly enough to flag Varden's situation before the Keswick engagement became a fatality case instead of an injury case. Nora submitted a written statement for Prahl's sentencing record. It was specific and not kind, but it was accurate. It noted the cooperation, noted the timeline of when it began, noted that 11 soldiers had been affected, and 4 had died and 2 had been injured before he had said a word, and it noted that those facts were the frame within which any consideration of cooperation should be understood. The statement was entered into the record as submitted. Prahl's defense counsel called her as a character witness, which was not something she had been expecting. Captain Calloway, the defense counsel said, in your assessment of Range Officer Prahl's conduct during the investigation, not the underlying offense, but the investigative cooperation, would you characterize it as genuine? She thought about Prahl in the monitoring room, reading the names, the tightening of his jaw, the look at nothing. Yes, she said. And does genuine cooperation in your professional assessment indicate anything about the character of the person providing it? It indicates they made a choice, she said, a specific one, at a specific moment. It doesn't retroactively change the other choices. But it is a choice, yes, she said, it's a choice. She left the stand and took her seat and did not look at Prahl, because she had said what was true, and she didn't need him to receive it in any particular way for it to be true. On the 18th day after she'd first walked into Range Delta in scrubs with a first aid bag, Nora sat across from Corporal Adkins in the Ward C break room. She was in the break room because she had been asked to return to the medical wing for a final administrative checkout. Her assignment at Harrow Peak was formally ending, her cover documentation being retired, her official status being updated in the installation's personnel records. Ward C's nursing rotation had been running without her for over 2 weeks, and had by all accounts been fine. Greta Souza had found a replacement for the IV bag counting system, who actually counted them, which was a better outcome than Nora's version. Adkins had been waiting outside the ward when she arrived. He'd clearly timed it. "I heard you're leaving," he said. "End of the week," she said. He nodded. He had the posture he'd had in the monitoring room doorway, the deliberate approach toward something he'd decided to say. "The audit flag on my score," he said. "The malfunction, they reviewed it?" "The equipment failure was formally documented," she said. "Your score from that session was flagged for review, and a clean evaluation was scheduled. You should have received the notification." "I did," he said. "The re-evaluation is next week." He paused. "I wanted to say thank you for noticing." "You would have gotten there," she said. "Maybe," he said. "But you were already there." She looked at him. He was 22 years old, with 3 years of service, ahead of a significant recalibration of what this installation meant and what trust looked like inside a military structure. That was not a small thing to carry. "The Keswick corridor," she said. "Varden's unit. 2 injuries," he nodded. He knew. "It could have been worse," she said. "It was going to be worse, before the audit flag and before the engagement timeline and before about 16 different things broke in a direction that kept it from being worse." She paused. "That's why the work matters. Not the dramatic version of it. The documentation, the notation, the record of a malfunctioning drive housing all of it. Even the IV bags," he said. It was not sarcastic. He meant it. "Even the IV bags," she said. He almost smiled. "Not quite. Close enough." She was finalizing her checkout documentation in the administrative annex that afternoon when Krause knocked on the door. He was holding a folder which was unusual for Krause, who handled most things digitally. "This came from Rasmussen's office," he said, "for your review before it's entered into the final case record." She took the folder and opened it. It was the formal causation summary, the document that established, for the official legal record, the chain of events from the first falsified qualification score to the Keswick corridor engagement to the 4 deaths and the 2 injuries. It was a legal document, which meant it was precise and structured, and largely without the kind of language that made things feel real. It was also the most complete single account of what had happened that existed. She read through it. She read it carefully, checking the representation of her investigative documentation, the accuracy of the financial record characterization, the specificity of the causation language. And then she got to the section on the deceased soldiers. Rasmussen's team had done something she hadn't asked for and hadn't expected. They had included alongside each name a brief factual notation, not a tribute, not a memorial language, just facts. Pemrick's service history, Fenwick's unit commendations, Anaya's field assessment scores, which were exceptional, which made the manner of her death more than usually bitter. Thrace, who had been 23 and who had received a unit commendation for conduct during a previous engagement that indicated real capability. 4 people who had deserved to be in the roles they were given, who had been failed before they even arrived. She read the notations twice. She closed the folder. "It's accurate," she told Krause. "Enter it." He nodded and took the folder, and she watched him leave, and then she looked at the desk, the empty desk in the borrowed office, that she would return the key to before the end of the week, and she sat with the weight of the full picture for a moment before she put it back in its proper place. The place where it belonged was not behind her. She knew better than that. It would be with her for a long time, not as something that broke her, but as something that had weight. Pemrick and Fenwick and Anaya and Thrace. The engagement in the Keswick corridor. Adkins's malfunction unrecorded. The sound of a steel target at 1,000 meters. She was thinking about all of it when her secure channel pinged. She opened it. The message was from a number she didn't recognize, not Taft, not Krause, not Rasmussen's office. A direct routing ID that resolved when she checked the origin classification to a Joint Assessment Command administrative desk she knew only from procedural documents. The message was 3 sentences. The first sentence was a notification that her assignment at Harrow Peak was formally concluded and commended. The second sentence was a notification that her post-assignment review had been completed at the Joint Assessment Command level. The third sentence was an assignment notification for her next posting. She read the posting location and the assignment parameters. Then she read them again. The location was not a military installation. It was not a range facility or a training command. It was a civilian oversight board, a joint civilian-military qualification standards body that had been established 18 months ago in the wake of the first set of casualty reports from the field engagements. That would eventually connect back to Harrow Peak. The board was responsible for designing the independent review mechanism for military qualification records that currently did not exist, the mechanism that, had it existed 14 months ago, would have caught Prahl's first falsified score before a single soldier deployed on a fraudulent qualification. Her assignment was to the board's standards architecture team. She read the role description. She read the scope of what the board had authority to develop. She thought about the 30-minute exploit window in the auto-conservant system that nobody had been looking for because nobody had known to look. She thought about the 7 soldiers still in the field with qualification records that were now under urgent review. She thought about what it would mean to build the system that made this kind of scheme impossible before it started. Not catch it afterward, not investigate the aftermath, but close the opening before anyone found it. She set the phone down on the desk. She picked it up again and read the 3rd sentence a 3rd time. And then she noticed something she had not noticed on the first 2 readings. The assignment had a co-lead. The name attached to the co-lead position was not anyone she'd worked with at Harrow Peak. It was not anyone from Taft's team or Krause's team or Rasmussen's office. It was a name she recognized from a different context, from a file she had read during her pre-assignment research. A file that had been heavily redacted but had contained enough to tell her that the person named was someone who had been investigating a parallel qualification fraud scheme at a completely different installation in a completely different region that had begun 2 months before Harrow Peaks, and that had produced a different set of deaths in a different corridor. Someone else had been doing the same work, in a different direction, following a different thread, and the Joint Assessment Command had put them in the same room. She looked at the name for a long moment. Then she looked at the assignment start date. 6 days. 6 days. She looked at the number the way you look at something that is both smaller and larger than you expected smaller, because 6 days was not much time to close out one posting and prepare for a different kind of work entirely. Larger because of what 6 days represented in the broader timeline. The board had been standing for 18 months. The parallel investigation the co-lead had been running had been moving for at least 14. The framework they were being asked to build should have existed before any of it, before Harrow Peak, before the other installation, before Pemrick and Fenwick and Anaya and Thrace, before 2 soldiers bled in a corridor in the Keswick region because a man had taken a percentage of someone else's crime and called it management. She put the phone in her jacket pocket. She picked up the key to the borrowed office, looked at the room one more time, the folding desk, the empty water pitcher she had never moved, the overhead light that buzzed faintly at a frequency that had stopped bothering her somewhere around day 30, and she set the key on the desk and walked out. She told Taft in person, which she owed her. Taft's office was in the command building, a real office with a real window and a chair she'd clearly had for years, because it had the specific wear pattern of furniture that has accommodated the same person's weight for a long time. Taft was behind her desk when Nora came in, and she looked up and read something in Nora's face before Nora said anything. "You got the assignment notification," Taft said. "You knew about it. I was consulted." Taft leaned back in the worn chair. "I recommended you." Nora stood in the doorway for a moment. "The board has been standing for 18 months, she said. "They've been doing framework development without a standards architecture team. They've been doing framework development without people who have actually been inside the problem," Taft said. "There's a difference. You've been inside it. Your co-lead has been inside a different version of the same problem. The board needed practitioners, not policy architects." "My co-lead," Nora said, sable. Taft's expression shifted slightly. "You know the name. From a redacted file I read during pre-assignment research for a different posting, 14 months ago. The redactions were significant. They would have been," Taft said. "Captain Sable's investigation was running concurrently with an active counterintelligence thread. Some of it is still sensitive. How much overlap is there between what she found and what I found? That's what the board needs the 2 of you to determine." Taft paused. "It may be more than either of you currently knows." Nora stood with that for a moment. The parallel thread, a different installation, a different corridor, a different set of names. The same system exploited through the same structural gaps. The possibility that what had happened at Harrow Peak was not an isolated criminal scheme, but a pattern, something that had found a consistent vulnerability and used it in multiple locations, which was a different and considerably larger problem than a single corrupt range officer and a greedy deputy commander. "The board's mandate," she said, "designing the independent review mechanism. That's the stated assignment. Is there a broader mandate?" Taft looked at her steadily. "The broader mandate is in the classified brief you'll receive at orientation," she said. "I can tell you it exists. I can't tell you its scope. Not here." Nora nodded. "Calloway," Taft said. She said it in the voice she used when she was setting aside the command register and speaking as something more adjacent to a person. What you did here, the 6 weeks, the documentation, the Hargrove interception, the Keswick flag, it was exceptional work. It was the work, Nora said. I did the work. Most people doing the work you were doing would have moved faster, Taft said. Would have pushed the formal disclosure before the authorization cleared, or made noise when the noise would have felt justified. You waited. You documented everything. You let the evidence build until it was complete rather than until it was sufficient. Nora thought about the long nights and the IV bags and the 6 weeks of being the ward nurse who belonged in the emergency wing and not on a military firing line. Sufficient evidence convicts one person, she said. Complete evidence builds a case that holds, Taft said. That's why the board needs you. She said it simply. Without the inflation, people sometimes put on things they mean as genuine compliments. Just the fact of it stated plainly. Nora received it the same way. Thank you, she said, for the authorization process, for getting here when you did. 4 days late, Taft said. You were here, Nora said. That's what mattered. The sentencing proceedings for Hargrove ran across 3 days, the second and third weeks after the charges were filed. Nora was present for all 3 days. Not because her presence was required. Her testimony had been submitted in written form, her investigative documentation was entered in full, and the case the JAG office had built was not dependent on her physical presence in the chamber. She was there because she had decided that she owed it to 4 names to be in the room, when the weight of those names was formally assigned to the man responsible for ignoring them. Hargrove's civilian counsel was skilled. She had expected that. The argument they constructed around the budget diversion, the systemic failure in remediation training, the characterization of Hargrove's role as crisis management rather than exploitation, it was coherent, internally consistent, and engaged seriously with the genuine institutional problems that had existed at Harrow Peak before any individual had done anything criminal. She found herself on the second day respecting the architecture of the argument even while its conclusion was false. But the financial record was the financial record. The lag interval was the lag interval. The 4 counts of gross negligence were attached to 4 names, and the names were not abstractions. On the third day, when the presiding judge read the verdict, the chamber was quiet in the specific way that legal spaces go quiet when the thing that has been built toward for weeks finally arrives. Hargrove sat with his civilian counsel on his left and his military counsel on his right, and he looked at the table the way he had looked at the table during the charge reading, at a point that had nothing in it, which she had come to understand was not dissociation, but a form of accounting. He was doing math, the private math of someone measuring what they are left with. Guilty on all counts. The sentencing recommendation from the JAG office was significant, and the presiding judge accepted it with modifications that reduced one element and enhanced another, so that the net result was slightly different from what Rasmussen had projected, but landed in the same general territory. A lengthy sentence, dishonorable discharge, forfeiture of all retirement benefits and service commendations, and a permanent bar from any government employment or military affiliation. The bar from military affiliation was the piece that mattered most in practical terms. It was the piece that meant the position and the rank and the borrowed size were gone permanently, not suspended pending appeal but gone, converted by the verdict into a different kind of permanent record. When the sentencing was read, Hargrove finally looked up from the table. He looked at the presiding judge. He looked at the JAG counsel. And then, briefly and without readable expression, he looked at Nora. She met his eyes. She didn't look away, and she didn't perform anything, not satisfaction, not severity, not the complicated thing that lived between them. She just held the look for the moment it lasted, which was brief, and then Hargrove looked away first, and his counsel was speaking to him in low tones, and the chamber was moving forward. She sat in the observer section for a moment after the gallery began to clear. Then she stood, picked up her coat, and walked out. Prahl's sentencing came 4 days later, and she did not attend. She had submitted her written statement. She had said what was true. The chamber would do what it did with or without her presence, and her presence would not change the weight of what Prahl had set in motion. He had made his cooperation, and he would receive its consideration, and the sentence would be what it was less than Hargrove's, more than symbolic, attached permanently to his service record. She learned the outcome through Krause, who messaged her the summary in 3 sentences. She read it. She noted that the sentence was consistent with the JAG office's recommendation and that the cooperation consideration had been factored at the lower end of the range which meant the record reflected clearly that cooperation at the end of a thing is different from having stopped the thing earlier, when stopping was possible. That was the right outcome. She closed Krause's message and moved on. The family notifications happened over 5 days, the week before her assignment start date. Taft had asked if she still wanted to conduct them personally, and Nora had said yes, and so she traveled to 4 different places over 5 days, one family in the Eastern Plains, one in a mid-sized city in the Northwest Corridor, one in a small town that took 3 hours to reach from the nearest regional transport hub, one in a suburb of a large city where Anaya's mother and 2 sisters lived in a house, with a garden that was still bearing late-season vegetables in the kind of way that continues regardless of what happens inside the house. She did not travel with a support team. She traveled with her documentation, the formal amendment to each soldier's casualty report, the legal summary of what had been discovered and what had been charged, the commendation records that had been updated to remove any language that could be read as attributing fault to the soldiers themselves, and she traveled with the specific, practiced intention of telling the truth to people who had been told an incomplete version of it and deserved the full one. The conversations were not easy. None of them were. The Eastern Plains family, Pemrick's parents, and a younger brother were quiet through most of it, and his mother asked her, at one point, whether the soldiers who had paid for false qualifications would face consequences, and Nora explained the charging process for those individuals honestly, including which ones were cooperating and what cooperation meant in legal terms. And Pemrick's mother nodded and said, "Good," in a tone that was not triumphant but was final, like a door being closed that had been opened too long. Fenwick's wife cried. Nora had expected that and did not manage it or try to move past it. She sat in a kitchen with bad lighting and let the woman cry for as long as she needed to, and then she answered every question that followed as specifically as she could, and when Fenwick's wife asked why it had taken so long to find this, why no one had caught it sooner, Nora told her the truth, which was that the mechanism for catching it hadn't existed, and that the reason she was now to spend the next phase of her career building that mechanism was because of the gap that allowed her husband and 3 others to be failed in the way they had been. "You're building it now," Fenwick's wife said. "After." "Yes," Nora said, "after." I know it doesn't change the timeline." Fenwick's wife looked at the table, at the kitchen light, at something in the middle distance. "Does it work?" she said. "When you build it, will it actually work?" "I don't know yet," Nora said. "But I know what it needs to do, and I know exactly where it failed before. And that's more than the people who tried to build it 18 months ago had. Because of what happened to my husband." "Yes," Nora said. "Because of what happened to him. It was a terrible equation. She didn't soften it into something more bearable. Fenwick's wife had lived inside the terrible equation for 8 months. She didn't need it softened. She needed someone to sit in it with her and say, yes, this is what it costs, and not look away. Nora sat in it with her. Anaya's family was different from the others, louder, more expansive, more people in the room at once. Anaya's mother and her 2 sisters and an aunt, who had driven in specifically and who spent the first 40 minutes asking forensically sharp questions about the legal proceedings, before arriving at the question under all the other questions, which was whether Anaya had been let down by the people around her or by the structure above those people. Nora told her that the honest answer was both, and that the structure had failed first, and that the people inside it had then made choices within that failure that ranged from criminal to negligent, to simply insufficient, and that the criminal ones were being sentenced, and the negligent ones were being recorded, and the insufficient ones were being used to design something better. Anaya's aunt looked at her for a long moment. "My niece was exceptional," she said. "I know," Nora said. "I read her assessments. She was exceptional." And she went into that deployment, trusting that the people around her had been evaluated correctly. Yes, she shouldn't have had to trust that, the aunt said. That should have been verified, independently, before she was ever in a position where it mattered. "That's exactly right," Nora said, "and it will be." The aunt nodded. She did not say thank you. Nora did not expect her to. Thrace's family was last. He had been 23 and from a mid-sized city, and the person Nora sat with was his father, a quiet man, a veteran himself, who read through the entire formal amendment to the casualty report before saying anything, which took approximately 12 minutes, during which Nora sat and waited. When he finished, he folded the document carefully along its existing creases and set it on the table and said, "He trusted the system." "Yes," Nora said, "he would have." That was him. The man was quiet for a moment. He didn't have a suspicious nature. He thought if something was official, it was real. He was right to think that, Nora said. The official record should have been real. That was the failure, not his trust, but what his trust was placed in. Thrace's father looked at her. He had been a soldier himself, which meant he understood the difference between institutional failure and personal failure in a way that not everyone Nora had spoken with that week had the framework to access. He understood it, and he was applying that understanding in real time, working it through, and she could see the effort of it in his face, the specific effort of separating grief from anger, from a version of something like resolution that was not the same as comfort but was adjacent to it. What happens to the others, he said. The soldiers in the field who have the wrong qualifications on paper. They're being assessed individually, she said. Urgent field reviews have been authorized for everyone whose record shows a qualification from the affected evaluation periods. Some of them genuinely earned their scores, and the records are accurate. Some of them didn't know their scores were inflated. Some of them paid for it. She paused. Each situation is being handled according to what the evidence shows. And the ones who paid. The ones who paid are being charged, she said. Their cooperation with the investigation is factored. Their actual skill levels are being independently assessed, and their deployment assignments are being adjusted to match what they can actually do. He was quiet. It won't fix what happened to your son, she said. I know that. Nothing in any of this will. No, he said. But it might fix what happens to someone else's. She looked at him. He met her eyes steadily, the way veterans sometimes do with the particular directness of people who have learned that looking away doesn't make the thing any less real. Then do that, he said. Fix it for someone else's. She drove back from that meeting in the kind of silence that isn't empty but full of 4 families and 4 sets of eyes and 4 versions of the same terrible equation and 4 different ways of arriving at the same basic demand, which was, don't let this happen again. She carried it the way she carried everything, not in front of her, not behind her, but alongside, a weight that moved with her rather than holding her in place. The Joint Qualification Standards Board was housed in a building that had once been a regional military administrative center and had been converted into a civilian military working space when the board was established. It was neither quite military nor quite civilian, the kind of institutional hybrid that tends to develop awkward aesthetics, mismatched furniture, and a specific bureaucratic culture of people who aren't entirely sure what the dress code is. Nora arrived on a Wednesday morning, found the parking situation more complicated than necessary, and carried her case through a lobby that smelled of floor wax and old carpet and the particular institutional neutrality of a space designed to serve everyone and reflect no one. Captain Sable was already in the conference room they'd been assigned. She was taller than Nora had expected from the sparse physical description, in the file tall and angular, with close-cropped hair going gray at the edges, wearing a jacket that was civilian, but pressed with the precision of someone whose military habits were structural rather than chosen. She was standing at the window when Nora came in, looking at the parking structure across the street, and she turned at the sound of the door. They looked at each other. Calloway, Sable said. Sable. A moment. Not uncomfortable. More like the moment before 2 people who have been working the same problem from different directions compare notes for the first time. A combination of relief and wariness. The specific energy of knowing the other person has been somewhere difficult without knowing exactly where. I read the Harrow Peak summary, Sable said. The unredacted version. I read what I could access of your investigation, Nora said, which wasn't much. It'll be more now. Sable turned from the window. Mine ran 14 months out of a training installation in the Aldervane region. Similar structure range qualification falsification, financial exchange, inflated scores entering the deployment pipeline. She paused. Different personnel. Same exploit window. Nora set her case on the table. The autoconvergence lag. 32 minutes in my case, Sable said. You had 30. Same vulnerability, different implementation, which means someone knew the vulnerability existed in both systems, Sable said. Whether they exploited it independently in 2 places, or whether there's a connective thread, that's what we're here to find out. Nora looked at the window, the parking structure, the gray morning sky beyond it. She thought about the classified brief that was waiting for her, and about what Taft had said. It may be more than either of you currently knows. How many from yours, she said. Deceased, 3, Sable said. 7 total, then. 3 she hadn't known about. 3 more names. She sat down at the table. Tell me about them, she said. Sable looked at her. Something in that look registered what Nora had asked, and why she'd asked it, not for the operational data, not for the investigative context, but because they were people and they had names, and the names mattered as the starting point for everything else. Sable sat down across from her and told her. They worked for 11 days before the board's formal orientation proceedings began. In those 11 days, before any policy document or framework architecture or systemic review mechanism had been drafted, they built a complete picture of what had happened in both investigations, the parallel timelines, the shared structural vulnerabilities, the divergent personnel chains, the financial traces from both cases laid side by side. And what emerged from that mapping was what Taft had implied, and neither of them had fully known. The 30-minute exploit window was not a coincidence in two systems. It was a design artifact, something embedded in the qualification management software's autoconserms function during a system-wide update 18 months ago, an update that had been administered by a contracted technical team. And that team's access logs showed something that had taken Krause's counterpart in Sable's investigation 3 months to unearth. The update had been tested. The exploit window had been identified in testing. And the testing record showed that the identification had been flagged as a low-priority correction and deferred pending the next update cycle. Someone had known. Not a criminal conspirator, not a deliberate architect to fraud, someone who had read a testing flags, assessed the risk as low, marked it for a later fix, and moved on. And in the gap between that assessment and the fix that never came, two separate criminal schemes had independently discovered the same opening and used it. It was not a conspiracy. It was something in some ways worse, a chain of small, ordinary failures. An update, a flag, a deferral, a gap, and then people making choices inside the gap. Nora wrote that down in her project notes. She wrote it in the specific structured language of a systems analysis document, but she also wrote, in a separate note that was not part of the formal record, what it meant to her personally, which was that the most dangerous vulnerabilities are not the ones that look dangerous. They are the ones that look manageable. The ones that get assessed as low priority and deferred and forgotten, and then become the exact opening that a Prahl or a Hargrove or their counterparts in Aldervane needed to build a system that killed people. She kept that note. She looked at it sometimes. The board's formal commendation proceedings happened on a Friday afternoon, 6 weeks into her assignment. She had been told it was coming. She had been given the date and the general format, a small formal gathering of board members, Joint Assessment Command representatives, and a limited number of outside personnel. She had been told it would be brief. It was not particularly brief. Rasmussen was there, which she hadn't expected. Taft was there, which she had. Krause was there, standing near the back with the tablet he carried everywhere, and he gave her a small nod when she came in that communicated something between acknowledgement and satisfaction that his usual professional neutrality didn't usually allow. Adkins was there too. He was in his service uniform, which meant he'd been given formal authorization to attend, which meant someone had decided his presence was appropriate, and she thought about that decision for a moment and decided she agreed with it. The commendation was read by the board's chair, a civilian administrator named Foss, who had the patient, specific quality of someone who had spent decades in the space between military and governmental structures and had made peace with the fact that neither one fully trusted the other. He read the citation carefully and completely. It named her work. It named the investigation. It named the charges and the verdicts and the outcomes. And it named 4 soldiers, Pemrick, Fenwick, and Naya Thrace. Not in a supporting clause, not in a parenthetical. In the primary citation, alongside the description of what the investigation had accomplished, as the reason the work had mattered, not as victims to be mourned, but as the people whose deaths had exposed a failure that, now that it was exposed, could not be permitted to exist again. She stood and received the commendation in the way she did most things without performance, without the compressed emotion that such moments sometimes produce in people who have been holding things for a long time. She received it as what it was, a formal acknowledgement, a piece of paper with names on it that would be part of a permanent record, and a moment that was not the end of anything but the formalization of a transition between what had been and what came next. After the formal proceedings, people moved toward the small refreshment arrangement in the corner, and the room became the particular combination of professional and personal that institutional events become after the formal part is over. Adkins came up to her. He was in full uniform and looked approximately 3 years older than he'd looked on the range, which 6 weeks of the kind of recalibration Harrow Peak had put him through could reasonably produce. "How's the reevaluation?" she asked. "Passed," he said. "Clean score. Precision track." He paused. "Sergeant Voss ran the evaluation personally." She looked at him. "How was that?" "Different," Adkins said. He seemed to be considering how to characterize it, and landed on. He watched. The whole time. Not for mistakes, just watching. Like he was paying attention. That's what it looks like, she said when someone is actually paying attention. Adkins nodded. He stood with her for a moment, in the comfortable silence of two people who don't need to fill the space. I thought about what you said, he said. The documentation, the IV bags, all of it mattering. I told my unit about it, he said. Not the whole story, just the part about why the record matters. Why the notation matters. Why the thing you almost don't bother writing down is sometimes the thing that changes everything. She looked at him, 22 years old, telling his unit about documentation. It was, she thought, a better outcome than most of what she did produced. Good, she said. He nodded and stepped back, and the room continued around them. Sable found her by the window as the event was winding down. The board chair wants a preliminary framework draft in 6 weeks, Sable said. I know. It's aggressive. It's also 8 weeks later than it should be, Nora said. Given what we know about the second installation. We'll get there, Sable said. She looked out the window. Same parking structure. Different light afternoon now. The kind of late gold that turned everything briefly better looking than it was. The connective thread in the software update. The testing flag that was deferred. That's going to be a complicated piece of the framework to address. Because it requires accountability for decisions that weren't criminal, Nora said. Yes, you can legislate against Prawl. You can't legislate against someone assessing a low priority flag as low priority. You can build a system where the assessment has to be reviewed, Nora said. Where deferred corrections in security-sensitive software require a second signature. Where the gap between identification and resolution can't exceed a defined window without escalation. Sable looked at her. You've been thinking about this for a while. Since the night I found the exploit window, Nora said. Since the first night I understood what the gap was. She paused. You build the wall where the water came through. Not everywhere else. Sable was quiet for a moment. The 3 from my investigation, she said. I've been meaning to ask the families from yours. How did those conversations go? Nora considered the question with the weight it deserved. Thrace's father told me to fix it for someone else's, she said. Sable absorbed that. That's what we're doing, she said. Yes, Nora said. That's what we're doing. 2 months later, the preliminary framework draft was submitted to the board. It was not a perfect document. Nora and Sable had argued about 3 sections extensively enough that 2 of them contained minority annotation. Sable's position documented alongside Nora's, both on record, because the board deserved to know where the architects disagreed rather than receiving a false consensus. The section on deferred correction accountability had gone through 11 drafts. The section on independent evaluation audit triggers had gone through 9. The section on family notification protocols for qualification-related casualties was the one they had agreed on from the beginning, which was almost unusual enough to note. The board approved it in the modified form that board approval usually takes with additions and adjustments, and a timeline for pilot implementation that was longer than either Nora or Sable wanted, but was what the institutional reality of a civilian-military hybrid body could produce. The pilot implementation was assigned to 3 installations. None of them was Harrow Peak. Harrow Peak was its own case. It was already implementing. Voss had sent her a copy of the new internal evaluation protocol he'd developed, which was not required and which she read carefully. It was competent work. It incorporated the audit trigger logic that she'd described in the framework and applied it to Harrow Peak's specific evaluation structure. There was a section on equipment malfunction documentation that was detailed enough to make her think he'd written it himself, word by word, with Adkins' case specifically in mind. She sent him a written response that was 6 sentences long and said what was true, which was that the protocol was solid and that its implementation would matter. He wrote back 3 words. Thank you, Captain. She read it and set it aside and went back to the framework's second phase development document, which was due in 3 weeks, and addressed the software update audit chain that had produced the exploit window in the first place. She worked on it carefully. She was specific about the failure point and specific about the fix. The way you have to be when you're building something designed to prevent a thing that has already happened from happening, again, not in theory, not in general, but in the exact location where the water came through. Outside the board building, the city moved through its November morning. The parking structure, the gray sky, the ordinary unspectacular business of the day. She had not become a different person through any of this. She was still the one who counted the IV bags, who filed the incident report that no one acted on, who stood at the back of a room and noticed things. She was still the one who got handed the standby assignment and did it anyway. She was still, in some fundamental way, the nurse everyone had looked past, not because the looking past had broken anything in her, but because it had never been able to reach the part of her that mattered. That was the thing people missed when they looked at someone like her and saw only what she appeared to be. The quiet ones, the ones doing the work no one checks on, the ones filling out the forms and counting the inventory and writing the notation that nobody thinks will ever matter, they are not biding time until they get to be something else. They already are something else. They have always been something else. You just weren't looking. And the failure to look is the gap. That is always the gap. Not the dramatic vulnerability, not the clever exploit, not the criminal mind that finds an opening. The gap is the moment someone stands in front of you and you decide, in about 2 seconds, that you already know what they are. Nora had spent her career in that gap. She had learned its dimensions. She knew exactly where it let the water in. Now she was building the wall. She pulled Vodek's second phase document toward her and picked up her pen and started from the place she always started, the beginning of the thing, clearly stated, without decoration, with all the precision that the work required. The exploit window is 30 minutes long, she wrote. It exists because someone decided the risk was low. Here is what low risk actually costs. She wrote for 3 hours without stopping.